Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, April 1st, 2020. This is the Economic Justice Law Review. We're going to do our weekly scholarship review. Got three exciting papers that recently came out that we're going to talk about really quick. And we're going to feature basically Beth Colgan's Economic Liberty and Criminal Justice. Right, that's the hot plate. That's the hot article for this week, published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. But before we get that, we got two other smaller pieces that we want to feature, or at least just talk about and put it out there for those that are interested in criminal justice. Again, I'm Andre Smith, Smitty Bonton, Andre Smith. You guys know me from Florida International University, Widener, Delaware Law School, also Penn State and Howard. So now we're doing our economic justice law review, and we're going to describe how some of these articles published, that some of them don't necessarily specifically deal with race, economic injustice, but it's my belief that almost every circumstance or dynamic of racial subordination can be recharacterized in terms of economics, and more specifically in terms of racially asymmetric market imperfections, and that's broken down into four components, right? Racially asymmetric market engagement or profit maximization, racially asymmetric market competition, racially asymmetric market information, and then racially asymmetric societal transaction costs and market externalities. Of course, you're going to hear me talk about those four categories of racially asymmetric market failures all the time, because we're going to use that to categorize and cabin all of these bits of scholarship into this repository. So thank you for coming along for this week's ride. Let's start with the first one, which is Jennifer Pizio, The Importance of Diversity and Inclusion in Healthcare Compliance, which is published in the Journal of Healthcare Compliance, 2020, in the 22nd edition, page 21. And basically, she is comparing the role of chief diversity officers that are in the employment context in more commercial corporations, and asking whether or not healthcare compliance officers can or should serve those same roles when it comes to not only just diversity, but also after diversity and inclusion. So typically when I talk about healthcare or racism in the healthcare market, we describe that as racially asymmetric transaction costs. Basically, as I'll quote here, underrepresentation in the healthcare industry reflects racially asymmetrical market employment competition. Racism in the delivery of healthcare services represents racially asymmetric transaction costs. However, to the extent chief diversity officers in the employment context have arguably not increased racial inclusion, is it fair to say such corporate programs are tantamount to Derek Bell's Racial Preference Licensing Act? So for those that remember Faces at the Bottom of the Well in 1992, Derek Bell proposed, or didn't propose, but he pondered the Racial Preference Licensing Act, which if racism is permanent, is it better, on the one hand, to allow individual suits like the Byron Allen case or what have you, where even if he wins, he gets a certain amount of money, but that doesn't guarantee a lot of competition or what have you, versus the Racial Preference Licensing Act, where basically you get to be racist so long as you you pay for that right, and that money, again, under Derek Bell's conception, would go to, I don't know, could go to HBCUs or some type of reparations, or just civil rights institutions, or self-help. Or progressive programs. So he pondered that in the late 80s, early 90s. And so the question becomes, have corporations and companies large insulated themselves from civil rights suits by having these chief diversity officers, right? Where the chief diversity officers don't actually get to make a significant impact when it comes to inclusion and diversity as far as hiring is concerned, and yet the company is protected from civil rights lawsuits because it has spent money on this diversity officer to try to make things better. And in that way, instead of paying a license to the government to be racist, they're paying the license to a private individual. And so I think when we talk about expanding the roles of chief diversity officers, or we talk about diversity and inclusion, that the benefits versus the cost is a very interesting take from the justice side, if you will. Okay. The second paper the second article we're going to talk about real quick that came out within the last week, or at least I became aware of in the last week, is another very interesting piece by short, but a very interesting piece by Nancy G. Abuda, Following the Blueprint: How a Generation of Segregationists is Advancing Racial Gerrymandering, and that's in the Human Rights Journal 2020. And I basically titled it School District Secessions as Gerrymandering in Louisiana. First of all, Ms. Abuda is belongs to the or works for the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we don't have a technically a law professor or scholar here, but a very committed writer with respect to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And her issue that she's talking about is the trend towards wealthy neighborhoods segregating and distinguishing themselves from other parts of an urban area, creating their own city and basically withdrawing the tax revenue and therefore the good public schools, and concentrating them in these wealthy inner cities, right? These are cities within cities, or attached to or a portion of. So they draw the tax revenue away from already struggling school districts, and so basically exacerbating racial and class segregation, and more specifically damaging already fragile funding for public schools in those neighborhoods that are left behind. And so this one is specifically talking about St. George's in Louisiana. I guess they're breaking off or attempting to break off from New Orleans. We know about the Highland Park District in Dallas. I'm here in Philadelphia, and one gets a little concerned about Center City and Rittenhouse Square, and whether there will ever be a time when those areas carden themselves off from the rest of the city, call themselves something different, and thereby draw the tax revenue away from the rest of the city. Northeast Philadelphia actually tried to do this several times over my lifetime, but was never actually successful. So this type of gerrymandering, because it also has, again, political implications for redistricting and all that, but this new way to segregate based on wealth, but then wealth being this proxy for race, is discussed by Nancy G. Abuda. My comment, or the EJLR comment toward with respect to this, is that newly created municipalities designed to segregate wealthy neighborhoods from poorer ones withdraw substantial tax revenue from school districts with predominantly black populations, thereby exacerbating asymmetrically distributed market information available to black people. Concentrated poverty in black neighborhoods tends also to produce market disengagement, or basically what we call racially asymmetric commitment to profit maximization or market participation. Really interesting stat here. I just want to give you that she included in her sources from Adam Harris in the new Secession in the Atlantic magazine last year. It says, according to a recent report from EdBuild, a nonprofit focused on public school funding, 73 communities have split to form their own school districts since 2000, and the rate of places doing so has rapidly accelerated in the past 2 years, right? So when we talk about starving the beast as a neoconservative program to transfer the incidence of taxation from wealthy and white to poor and black, it also includes restricting the money that they do pay towards themselves, the wealthy, that is. Again, the Star of the Beast as a neoconservative program is there to create create a society where an aristocracy, small aristocracy, runs everything, and we see that coming to fold. A small number of philosophers behind it, not the cadre of college graduates that are running all over the place now. And then the rest of the vulgar, the vast majority being the vulgar who can't be helped. So there's no point in giving them social programs, that their way to nobility should be through military or valorous service against others. And again, those others can be foreign or domestic, real or imagined. And so that's how race plays in, to be able to control the vulgar by setting them against each other, especially the majority whites that have a nationalistic fervor, right? So all of this, so I say all that to say that, again, the separation of school districts, taxes, death and trouble, what we're going to talk about now, taxes, fine, as informal racist and aggressive taxes as criminal justice debts and what have you. It's all part of the same program. It is all part of the same economic debilitating program. And the ultimate goal, of course, when we talk about a systemic structural racism and why it is maintained through interest convergence and divergence. Well, the major interest that it serves even right now is that as Black people are economically subordinated and an impoverished class, we have to now be on the front lines of the coronavirus response. Right. And so the jobs that people don't want to be doing, Black folks by and large don't have the privilege to quarantine and social distance if you're also the mailman, if you're also a sanitation worker, etc. So I just want to make that note of how all of this, regardless if we're talking about school districts, we're talking about health disparities, there is an absolute economic component that is not just present, but it also perpetuates economic subordination into the future by skewing the market. That's why we're talking about these asymmetries, right? All right, so our featured paper for today is a absolute beaut of a paper, Beth Colgan of UCLA. And she's talking about the economic consequences of criminal justice sanctions. And again, this is the main part of what I talk about incessantly about taxes, death, and trouble, how Star of the Beast tax cuts created the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, again, Star of the Beast tax cuts for the wealthy means raising taxes on other people. And when we talk about raising taxes informally, racist and regressive taxes, we can talk about soda taxes, we can talk about wage taxes, but we also talk about these informal taxes as criminal justice fines, fees, forfeitures, right, that are running rampant, where cities are raising revenue instead of protecting public safety through these fines and fees. And so Beth Colgan, or Colgan, has written Economic Liberty and Criminal Justice. It is published in this edition of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, 2020. Beth Colgan has only been in the game. I've researched her stuff. She's only been in the law teaching game since 2014, but her publishing record is long, and it precedes her entry into law schools. So I'm very excited that this author, I left, I think my last year teaching was 2016 or 2017. And that's when I published Taxes, Death, and Trouble. And she seems right then just to be getting going. And so she even has a bibliography for me, right, in her source notes about some of the more recent scholarship on criminal justice fines and fees and how they're used to raise revenue instead of protect the public safety. And the prevalence of them in Black neighborhoods, Black jurisdictions, Black cities is again is racially, economically debilitating. And so we say here, to the extent criminal justice debts are designed to raise revenue instead of promote public safety, and to the extent they are disproportionately imposed on Black people, law enforcement financial obligations represent informal, regressive, and racist taxes. They represent racially asymmetric societal transaction costs and externalities. This paper is fantastic. I want to just skip ahead to the solutions because we can talk about for those that don't know. Again, when we talk, this goes all the way back, not all the way back. The best represent we can give you from this is Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the Justice Department's report on Ferguson, Missouri, made very clear that the Ferguson Police Department was raising revenue by giving Black people all these fines on any manner of violations, from dog barking, overgrown weeds, the wrong, not having your bicycle registered or what have you. And so the overcriminalization was in Black neighborhoods. We're stopped more often than when we went to court. There would be more, we would be fined higher amounts. When we don't pay, it would be likely to be found contempt of court, and therefore another incarceration. They would even charge the defendant 25 cents a mile or 75 cents a mile for the cop to serve the warrant. And once you're in jail, there's the fees for phone calls, all those things. So probationary fees afterwards, then the interest. And so to the extent these are not designed to keep us safe, to the extent they're not designed to promote public safety, these are taxes. City of Ferguson, I believe, raised maybe, what was it, between something 13 or 18% of their municipal budget through taxation. And that's on the high end, but it's not in the top 10 or 20, even in the country. From PG County, Maryland, we just saw a study in Washington, D.C. about how the speed cameras have these exorbitant fines, and they're still set up in Black neighborhoods despite the gentrification of DC. The cameras still find their way disproportionately in the Black neighborhoods. We have studies that show that the likelihood that a city will use criminal justice fines and fees and forfeitures to raise revenue correlates with the amount of Black people in the jurisdiction. The more Black people there are, the more likely they're going to try to pass off the taxation, reduce property taxes, reduce income taxes if they have them, and then fill those budget gaps through criminal justice fines, fees, and the over-policing. And we shouldn't have to say that over-policing in Black neighborhoods, that increasing the confrontations between police officers and Black folks leads directly to the Black Lives Matter movement. Solutions that Beth Colgan is offering are, number one, raise taxes. She recognizes the root of the problem being that we're trying to raise money instead of protect public safety. Secondly, decriminalization or legalization. Everything doesn't have to be a crime, right? So the over-criminalization, especially when it occurs in Black neighborhoods, is not just a deprivation of liberty, but it is also the deprivation of significant property. We're talking billions of dollars nationwide, billions. And if we're concerned about the racial wealth gap, how can we not be concerned about billions of dollars being extracted from the most vulnerable among us, including kids? The school to prison pipeline includes these fines and these fees, interest, and all that saddle kids for failure and hamstring them in life before they even turn 18 years old. Other remedies, she would like, again, there's a movement to reduce the incidence of driver license suspensions for the non-payment of debts, because how am I going to pay the debts if you suspend my license and I can't get to work? Leaving them in place is, again, what is incongruent. It's inconsistent with trying to promote public safety and respect the individuals, and it helps to suggest that this is also towards impoverishing black people as a class, removing them from market competition. If you're talking about this driver's license suspension, you're talking about creating felonies out of every particular offense. There's also, she also suggests that the due process clause should be invoked when we find that court systems are being funded directly from these fines, fees, and forfeitures, right? From smaller towns, we might see the specific earmarking or dedicating of fines, fees, and forfeitures towards the maintenance of the courthouse or even the police department, so that the police officers and the judges know that their jobs depend on more and more and more criminalization and over-criminalization and levying these taxes on poor black people. Remember, the sheriff of Nottingham was a tax collector, right? Other instances, right, other ways to solve this issue is Bearden versus Georgia, where, again, the argument is that you can't incarcerate people strictly because they can't pay debts, but at the same time, they're getting around it by saying that you're not being incarcerated for not paying the debt, you're being incarcerated for contempt of court, for not showing up, or for missing a payment plan that the court has deemed you have the ability to pay. And the worst thing about these ability to pay hearings is, imagine having to participate in one. Your goal is to pay as little as possible. The judge's goal is to get you to pay the most. So the dynamic is a citizen going in and groveling, wearing their worst gear, their worst uniform, trying to look as disheveled as possible, as undignified as possible, while at the same time the judge examines the person for any sign of wealth, a wherewithal, a ring, a good hairdo, nice sneakers or shoes as the reason why you should be paying. I mean, these hearings, while on the one hand absolutely necessary if we're going to continue this type of things, they also in themselves, even if done quote unquote well, involve a certain or a significant amount of degradation. And I think where degradation comes, economic withdrawal and disengagement follows, and we don't want that. There's also the possibility to reinvigorate or invigorate the excessive fines clause. Many people don't know that Timms versus Indiana, the Supreme Court held unanimously, I believe, that the excessive fines clause of the Fifth Amendment is applicable in the states, and therefore when states and local jurisdictions levy this was specifically dealt with forfeiture. So seizing a whole vehicle or a house just because someone, so a cop found a joint, right? That disproportionality can be against the excessive fines clause. Now, this has to hopefully be extended towards just not just forfeitures, but your regular fines. And more than that, we have to find ways to argue systemic and structural racism, that this particular fine or fee may not in itself seem to be excessive with respect to this individual. However, with respect to the group, with respect to group subordination, it is absolutely excessive and debilitating. Now, I say that knowing that this system, the Supreme Court, insists on a legal architecture built around individual rights. And this recognition of group rights is problematic. And yet we have to persist, because just because it's problematic to the court doesn't mean we abandon it if it's right and just. Okay, she also finishes with the idea that the Sixth Amendment right to counsel should also be invoked when it comes to fines, fees, and forfeitures, because at the most part, the right to counsel relates to your deprivation of liberty, and the deprivation of property is even under a different standard, right? When it comes to civil asset forfeiture, all they have to prove is that it is more likely than not that it was tied to a crime, where the actual crime itself requires what? Belief beyond a reasonable doubt. So those are the solutions that Professor Colgan of UCLA offers with respect to what I call taxes, death, and trouble, or regressive and racist taxes disguised as criminal justice fines and fees. I want to continue a little bit. First of all, I was speaking about Professor Colgan. She's a professor of law at UCLA. I want to big her up because, again, she seems to be off to a very hot start and is definitely doing a great job on an issue that I care about. And the interesting thing is she has mentioned race, but she's looking at it from a class perspective. But just from my perspective, it's just super easy to convert it from a class to a racial perspective. She's published numerous pieces on this particular issue, reviving the excessive fines clause in the California Law Review in 2014, graduating economic sanctions according to ability to pay, Iowa Law Review in 2017. And that's very interesting, right? That a poor person caught speeding should not pay the same fine as a wealthy person speeding, right? That if we talk about almost like taxation, we only tax the poor or the low income 10, 12, 14, 15, up to 20%, but then the wealthy are expected to pay over 25, 30, 40%, and should be higher than that, but we're going to leave that alone. The issue, the justification for that is that it's equal in pain. Right? Progressive taxation is justified on an equal pain basis, that the marginal utility of a dollar, you remember marginal utility back in econ class? Right. Well, the diminishing marginal utility of money means you're going to have to take a lot of it away from wealthy people for it to hurt them, and therefore to deter them from speeding, right? And it also would help fund government, right? So she has a very interesting piece on graduated economic sanctions according to ability to pay. She writes on it from a class perspective. We're going to have to bite on that and talk about it from a racial perspective. Very, very good stuff. She's also the author of the Excessive Fines Clause, Challenging the Modern Debtor's Prison, in UCLA Review, Wealth-Based Penal Disenfranchise. Again, that's dealing with voting. So we're talking about economic structure of the market and the structural racism, then we're talking about racially asymmetric transaction costs once again, because the voting booth is where we get all these transaction costs and market externalities distributed or maldistributed to the extent black folks are disenfranchised disproportionately. She also wrote this year, and that's or last year, something for the Brookings Institute, addressing modern debtors' prisons with graduated economic sanctions that depend on the ability to pay. I just want to close out her piece with a bunch of sources. I had to pour through her footnotes to find some excellent sources. So if you're interested in this topic, and I definitely am, so I'm going to be going through a lot of these folks' stuff. Some of them I know already, but some of them are new. Mike Masieg, Addicted to Fines, Small Towns in Much of the Country Are Dangerously Dependent on Punitive Fines and Fees. Teresa Zen, Colorblind Reform, How Ability to Pay Determinations Are Inadequate to Transform a Racialized System of Penal Debt. I like that one. Michael Sanchez and Hee Young Yu. I know this one. I cited this in my book, Taxes, Death, and Trouble. You can find it on Amazon. Who Pays for Government? Descriptive Representation and Exploitative Revenue Sources. Right? And that, I believe that's the paper that makes the claim that the amount of black, the likelihood that a municipality will use criminal justice fees to raise revenue correlates to the amount of black folks in that jurisdiction. Alexis Harris, Heath Evans, and Catherine Beckett, Drawing Blood from Stones, Legal Debt and Social Inequality in the Contemporary United States. I've used that. Helen A. Anderson, penalizing poverty, making criminal defendants pay for their court-appointed counsel through recruitment and contribution, right? So they're even trying to expand it. Tara Gamboa Eastman, the problem with probation, a study of the economic and racial impact of probation fees in California. Brianne Plegencool, the financial cost of a criminal conviction, came out in 2018. The Council of Economic Advisors, fines and fees. Oh, this was under the Obama administration. The Council of Economic Advisors published called Fines and Fees and Bail, Payments in the Criminal Justice System that Disproportionately Impact the Poor. Jessica Fireman of the Juvenile Law Center published Debtors' Prisons for Kids. This is what I'm talking about. We're getting our kids young, kill them before they grow, as Bob Marley would have said. The high cost of fines and fees in the juvenile justice system. I know of another author that's written on that, Alex Tenikoff or Kirilov or something like that. Sorry, I don't have the names precise. I'll find her stuff. Alex Picaro and Wesley Jennings, justice system imposed financial penalties increase the likelihood of recidivism in a sample of adolescent offenders, right? So not only is it transferring the incidence of taxation of funding government from wealthy and white to poor and black, not only is it debilitating black folks and putting in a subordinate class that always has to do the dirty work, it is also causing recidivism, because if I'm so broke, I'm not going to put up with these dead-end dirty jobs. Some of us are going to then lash out and join the underground system, which leads back to the school-to-prison pipe or the prison pipeline. Lisa Foster and Joanna Weiss, American courts should not be turned into revenue machines, on the Hill magazine, right? And Mario Salas, Angela Coelfi, Legal Aid Justice Center, Driven by Dollars, a state-by-state analysis of driver license suspension laws for failure to pay court debt. Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. The Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. We just finished Black History Month, and then Women's History Month. So the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, who pays the true cost of incarceration on the whole family. So this featured piece by Beth Colgan, Economic Liberty and Criminal Justice, is just a very, very, very useful tool, and she is a very, very good scholar to follow to get a good handle on what I call racist and regressive taxation. And to me, it is one of the central parts of structural racism, the neoconservative plot to exacerbate the racial wealth gap. The only thing I would want from her, not want from her, she puts it in a class-based system. I would not only convert it to discuss how these have their racial implications, but also tie them to the Starve the Beast concept, to show how taxes are being cut incessantly with respect to the wealthy and white. But then when it comes to soda and sin taxes, and then criminal justice fines and fees and other types of taxes, those are being increased when it comes to black and brown people, right? And so this exacerbating of the racial wealth gap is not, in my view, a coincidence. It is structural, it is systemic. However, there are people putting fuel onto the fire, and they are called neoconservatives. So my progressive folks, as much attention as you pay to neoliberalism,